Hello and welcome to The Take with Sophy Ridge, live at 9 here in the heart of Westminster. Well, Parliament may be on recess this week, but we are not going anywhere, and neither is Boris Johnson. He's back in the news again after very publicly offering all of his unredacted WhatsApp messages to the COVID inquiry. Well, now the Cabinet Office will decide whether or not to hand them over. What's holding them back? Well, remember, it's not just messages that Boris Johnson sent, but ones he might have received from other members of the government. On the show today, we'll bring you takes from all sides over the next 60 minutes, including, joining us this evening, Energy Minister Amanda Solloway from the government, and we'll also be talking to the former number 10 Chief of Staff, Lord Barwell. Plus, we'll talk to Labour's Shadow Employment Minister, Justin Madders, and much more besides on The Take. Hello, good evening. Well, Boris Johnson is once again dominating things here at Westminster, but there's been plenty more going on as well. So let's start with the best bits of the week so far.
In the statement that's just been released, that all of Boris Johnson's material, including WhatsApps and notebooks that have been requested by the COVID inquiry, has been handed now to the Cabinet Office in full and in
through because it's broken the deadlock, really, and the standoff between the Baroness Hallett, Lady Hallett, the retired appeal court judge, and the government in particular, and also Boris Johnson.
Absolutely certain and confident that the Cabinet Office will be engaged in this in exactly the right kind of way.
We start this hour with breaking news. ITV says it has instructed a barrister to carry out an external review of the facts following Philip Schofield's statement and departure from this morning.
So we happen to be in the news at the moment, and of course we appreciate that.
It started to hurt the ITV brand and This Morning brand, which is very wholesome, and the facade of that started crumbling over the past week or so. It started hurting the bottom line as well. ITV shares down 1%.
The US has moved a step closer to averting a disastrous default on its debt.
It's about money, of course it is, but it's also very much about politics. The debt ceiling is the cap on US borrowing. Without lifting that debt ceiling, America wouldn't be able to pay its bills.
After weeks of negotiations, we have come to an agreement in principle. We still have a lot of work to do, but I believe this is an agreement in principle that's worthy of the American people.
We'll be talking a bit more on the show about the issues in the US with our US correspondent Mark Stone. But first, a man who knows a thing or two about ructions in the Conservative Party and the workings of the Cabinet Office and Downing Street. That's the former number 10 Chief of Staff, Lord Barwell, who joins us now live. Thanks very much for being with us. So Boris Johnson's handed over his unredacted WhatsApps. Do you think the Cabinet Office should pass them on to the COVID inquiry now?
I do, yeah. I think that lots of the people viewing this programme will have lost loved ones in the pandemic. They have a right to answers about what the government got right, what it got wrong, what the lessons are for last time. The government set up this inquiry. They presumably trust Baroness Hallett that they've put in charge with it, and they should trust her to make the judgment about what can be put into the public domain and what can't. I think if they don't hand over this material, then people are not going to have confidence that the inquiry's seen everything that it needed to see.
I guess just to put the counter-argument, do you think there's a nervousness about people's right to privacy here? We've seen what's happened when Matt Hancock's WhatsApps end up in the public domain. Some fascinating, but perhaps not really relevant messages getting out there. Could be a bit embarrassing.
Yeah, so I think there's three things I'd say to that. Firstly, it depends what you mean by privacy. So if you mean messages that are unconnected with the pandemic response, then I think the government needs to trust the inquiry that those things are not going to find their way into the public domain. If you mean messages between ministers before the government have made a collective decision, which I think is what the real concern is, then normally I think those things should stay private. But this is an exceptional circumstance. Thousands and thousands of people lost their lives, and all of us suffered significant restrictions on our freedoms. And I think that justifies sharing that information so the inquiry can really get to the bottom of what happened. And you're quite right to say, Sophie, that it might be, some of the messages might be embarrassing for some ministers. I guess probably if your or my WhatsApp messages were all shared, we might find one or two of them embarrassing. But it's not really about whether ministers are embarrassed. It's not about finding individuals who've said embarrassing things. It's trying to understand how the government decided to do what it did, where the mistakes were made, what it got right. And so I'd say to ministers, you've got to kind of look, it's not about you. It's about getting the truth for all those people in this country, many of them may be watching this programme, who lost people in the pandemic and want to understand what went on. And I think the government needs to see the bigger picture there.
I guess one of the reasons that I'm wondering whether or not there's a certain nervousness in government at the minute is because these are not messages that were just sent by Boris Johnson. They could be messages received by him as well, including the person who was then Chancellor, now Prime Minister. Is this perhaps part of the reason there is this reluctance to hand them over?
Yeah, that may well be a factor. There'll be a number of people still serving in government who were ministers at that time. But I just come back to the point that I was trying to make to you, that these inquiries often are difficult for ministers, embarrassing for ministers. I had to give evidence to the Grenfell inquiry, and going through the decisions you took and working out where you got things right and where you made mistakes, it's painful, but it's not about you. The reason you give that evidence is to try and help, the families of people who lost loved ones understand what went on. They have a right to hear the truth. And also because the purpose of these inquiries isn't just find someone to blame, it's to learn lessons, because there is going to be another pandemic. And we need to make sure that next time we do a better job of responding to it. And we can only do that if we get to the truth about what really went on in government and how these decisions were made. So I'm sure you're right that there's a nervousness about what some of these messages are going to look like. But as I said, you've got to see the bigger picture here, and you've got to trust the person that the government has put in charge of this inquiry.
Just to zoom out for a minute, we're once again talking about Boris Johnson. Do you think Rishi Sunak is ever going to be able to escape his shadow?
So I think Boris Johnson is going to loom large over our politics for a long time to come. And a lot of the issues that Sunak has had to deal with are problems that he's inherited from Boris Johnson, whether it's sorting out the Northern Ireland Protocol or the accusations in relation to Dom Rod. There's a whole range of these issues that have landed on his desk that are not of his making. But I suspect, fascinating as it is for everybody in the Westminster bubble, that actually most people in this country are not interested in the psychodrama within the Conservative Party. They want to understand what went on in government during that critical period. So, we mustn't allow that psychodrama to distract us from the core issue here, which is making sure that the inquiry has the information it needs to do its job.
If I may, and I agree with you about the psychodrama, but I'm just going to dwell on it for one more moment, if I may. Do you think this is also partly about the, let's be frank, pretty toxic relationship between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak? Is Boris Johnson trying to be as unhelpful as possible here, saying, look, I'm going to get them all over, I'm going to get them unredacted, it's not my problem?
I suspect he feels that the statement he put out tonight has put the Cabinet Office in a very difficult position, and he probably takes a little bit of pleasure from that. But look, I'm, as you probably know, I'm not a member of the Boris Johnson fan club, but I actually think he's done the right thing here. The inquiry needs to see this information. So him saying, well, if the Cabinet Office won't do it, if I'm asked for it, I will provide it. I think he's done the right thing. Even if you're not his biggest fan, you should give him some credit for that.
Fair enough. I want to say as well, thank you for taking the time out this evening. We've seen a couple of your family members, I think, drifting around in the background, which I think just shows, that you're juggling probably a million things. So we'll let you get back to family life. Thank you very much for being on this programme. Gavin Barwell speaking to us there. Well, let's get the view from the government now. A little earlier, I spoke to the Energy and Consumer Minister, Amanda Solloway. She's in charge of a new push to get people to claim all of the energy support that's available. I did, though, of course, have to start with that news about Boris Johnson. We're just going to start on Boris Johnson. It does feel like he's always in the news at the minute, but the COVID-19 inquiry demanded his unredacted WhatsApps from the pandemic. He's now handed them to the Cabinet Office. Are they going to give them to the inquiry?
I don't know. I mean, obviously the inquiry has been started to make sure that we actually look at the pandemic, examine it rigorously, think about lessons learned, think about the transparency, ensure that obviously we do the right thing in the future. So far, as you will know, there's been a lot of information that has been handed over. I know that the Prime Minister is committed to being helpful. So I can't preempt what's going to happen, but like you, I've just seen the news, so that's as far as I have on this.
Understood. I guess some would wonder why the Cabinet Office wouldn't hand over the unredacted messages. I mean, if you were being cynical, I guess you might wonder if it's because Rishi Sunak, other members of the government might have some incriminating messages themselves between them and Boris Johnson.
As I say, I can't preempt what is going to happen next. I do believe that the right thing to do is the inquiry, because we definitely need to look at lessons learned, completely unique time that we went through. But in terms of preempting what's going to happen, I'm afraid I can't do that.
I mean, I get that, you obviously think the inquiry is a good thing, and for the reasons you've outlined, they've asked for the unredacted messages, so why would you not give them to them?
As I say, my understanding is that everybody, the Prime Minister is committed to helping in this situation, is committed to the inquiry, the Cabinet Office as well, and the inquiry is ongoing. So I don't want to be preempting what will be happening.
OK, understood. Now, you've come on the show, you've talked about Boris Johnson, so let's talk a bit about what you want to talk about. And it is important because you're trying to make sure that people claim the energy support that's available to them. So what's the plan there?
Yeah, so as you will know, over winter for a 6-month period, everybody had who was available had £67 or thereabouts popped into their account to help towards energy bills. In the case of prepayment meters, the way that this was delivered was through a voucher system that was usually posted by the supplier. On occasion, very rarely, was emailed. And so far, we've had around about £650 million of support has been given to people on prepayment meters. However, the redemption time is June the 30th. And so today we're having a day where we're going around and saying, please, let's do all that we can. We've done so much already. We've had leaflets, we've been engagement with post office, been out to CABs, I've been holding stakeholder meetings, lots and lots of different things that we have been doing. But we're having one final effort to make sure that people are redeeming the vouchers. And it's really important for me to do this because it could be, obviously, there could be vacant properties, people could have moved. But I also am concerned that it's a group of vulnerable people who haven't realised that they have had these vouchers through the post or in their email. And so that's why we're having a final push on this.
Really important, as you say, for all of those people to make sure that they do have access to the money that they have available to them. There's one other story that I'm keen to talk to you about that's emerged recently, and that's about speeding fines or driving fines. You repaid an £80 fine that you claimed on expenses in 2020.
Yes.
What was that for?
Yeah. So first of all, when I had the news, I was just absolutely devastated. I had, I wouldn't intentionally want to do anything. It was a genuine admin error, and it was for a congestion charge. And obviously, as soon as I found out, I paid it back, and also making sure that I look at ways in the future, making sure that this doesn't happen again. But the fact is, it did happen. I paid it back, and that's one of the. I knew I would be likely to be asked about this today. However, I wanted to come on, to say, it's a genuine mistake, and I have paid it back. But two, I also want to make sure that we go back to a really important point, that a group of people for the £400 is such an important amount of money. And if we don't, what I really am concerned about is it could be a group of people who aren't opening their letters, who aren't answering the door, who actually we should be doing something about. And so my plea is, if you haven't redeemed your voucher, do so. But if you know anybody who might be on a prepayment meter, who could have received one of these vouchers, knock on the door or encourage them to redeem these vouchers.
I've just got one other query on the fine. How do you accidentally claim for a congestion fine on your expenses?
I think, well, it was done in error. I didn't do it. It was done in error. But as soon as I've discovered it, I've paid it back.
OK. And just to end, I've got to ask about that Blondie picture behind you. It's pretty eye-catching.
There you go.
Are you a super fan?
Yeah. I love artwork, and it was just I like black and white, as you can probably tell. Yes. So there we go.
OK. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. You take care. Bye-bye.
All right, on the programme today, we have got lots of analysis from our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who's with me now. One big story in Westminster today, all about these Boris Johnson unredacted WhatsApp messages. What do you think the government's line is right now? Is it going to hold?
Well, up to now, it has been that we don't want to hand over all these documents and all these WhatsApp messages, notebooks, and so on. They said in a pretty punchy statement, our view is that the inquiry doesn't have the power to request what they keep calling unambiguously irrelevant information that's beyond the scope of this investigation. They're talking about people who are government employees having the right to a private life. These emails are perhaps not about work, they're personal, and so on. Now, I thought it was interesting in your interview with Gavin Barwell, he said that this inquiry is an exception. He said, normally, I'd agree you don't have to hand over all this material, but this is an exception, he said. We owe it to the people who lost their relatives of those who lost their lives. And so that argument perhaps will sway in Whitehall, hasn't yet. And really, I mean, we all know that Boris Johnson likes a game of tennis. Well, he's put the ball firmly in Rishi Sunak's court tonight, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has. This is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because in a way, you think this is all about Boris Johnson. He's saying he'll hand over his messages. But is it really about Rishi Sunak, do you think?
Well, he was Chancellor. And, of course, he had this policy of eat out to help out, which some claim caused some damage, caused some people to perhaps catch COVID. Obviously, it cost a lot of money. What went on? But clashes between ministers. I mean, there were suggestions, weren't there, that perhaps Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, perhaps was not keen on that. All sorts of disagreements may emerge, of course, and that's... There is a suspicion among some MPs this is all about protecting not just the Prime Minister, but other ministers who are still in government. One thinks of Michael Gove, for example, the key players. I mean, thinking back to all those news conferences in Downing Street, regular attendees, well, Matt Hancock's not in government anymore, but Grant Shapps was at some of those, wasn't he? And so I think there will be nervousness. I mean, the Liberal Democrats have been saying the last 24 hours, you can't keep using Boris Johnson as an excuse. And there is a suspicion perhaps they are. So the clock's ticking. 4 o'clock tomorrow, they've got to make up their mind. If they go to court, that'll look terrible, won't it? Trying to withhold some of the information. Bad politics if they do that.
It really is. At the same time, though, you do wonder how bad some of these WhatsApps could look. I mean, do you think this kind of gets to the core issue about WhatsApp? Because people do use it in quite a casual way. You make jokes on it. You know, I'm thinking there, you mentioned Michael Gove for some of those messages that were leaked between him and Matt Hancock, for example. It's a bit blurred.
Government by WhatsApp these days, isn't it? Do you remember when Tony Blair became Prime Minister? People criticised him for what was called sofa government because he had all these informal meetings without civil servants. But we now very much have. And we saw it actually in the leak of the Matt Hancock WhatsApps that he handed to Isabel Oakeshott, the journalist, and they appeared all over the Daily Telegraph. So we know how embarrassing these can be. And our own colleague Sam Coates has come up with some belter WhatsApps, hasn't he, between Conservative backbenchers. People are pretty indiscreet at times, aren't they? And we know from Dominic Cummings, for example, some of the insults that were flying around, some of the things he was saying, for example, about Matt Hancock, and he called Boris Johnson the trolley, didn't he? A supermarket trolley out of control. So there could be real box office. Great for us, but embarrassing for the government.
I think that's it. It feels very intimate, doesn't it? But there is still a record of what you write on WhatsApp. John, thanks very much for your analysis. We'll have more from John later on in the programme. You are watching The Take. We're live in Westminster for you this evening. Next up, we're going to be going live to Washington now for an update on the negotiations over the debt ceiling and the latest on the battle to be the Republican presidential nominee. Welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Well, we are live in Westminster, but want to go to Washington now because the United States government is considered so reliable as a borrower that the certainty that it will repay its debts forms the basis for much of global finance, and so default seemed unthinkable. But it all got a bit thinkable in the last few days and weeks because the Democratic White House and the Republican Congress couldn't agree a deal to raise the debt ceiling, which limits how much the US can borrow. Well, let's get the latest live from Washington, D.C. now with our US correspondent, Mark Stone. Mark, how serious are things there?
Hi, Sophie. Look, I think it is only in America that you could have quite such a high-stakes game of chicken, but that is what has been happening here over the course of the past few weeks. It hasn't got massive headlines beyond the United States, I think largely because the expert consensus has been that even the crazies over on Capitol Hill would eventually come to their senses and the game of chicken would end peacefully. The issue, though, is that if it doesn't, and there is still a question mark, then the impact for all of us of the United States defaulting is absolutely huge. This isn't about the United States government shutting down. You may remember we've heard that in the past. The government shuts down because they can't get a deal on whatever. This is different. This is about defaulting on its debt and not being able to pay its bills because they can't agree to raise the debt ceiling. Well, it's coming to a head tonight on Capitol Hill. Those two men you just saw there, the president and Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, have been hammering it out for days now. These are two men who have fundamentally different visions for America. One, the centre-left president, some say pretty far-left president, the other, a right-wing Republican. And they are trying to get the people that you can see there to vote tonight at 8:30 local time to agree a deal that they have hammered out. But there are people on the far right of politics, the troublemakers to the right of Kevin McCarthy, who do not want this deal to go through. And then there are those on the far left of politics, the likes of Bernie Sanders, who also don't want this deal to go through. Now, I think they probably find themselves with certain amount of cover now in that it will go through and they can vote against on principle. The reality, though, is if this fails and they go back to the negotiating table and ultimately if it fails completely, well, then, yes, the global economy is in big trouble. But it does appear as though they do have a deal, a cap on spending for the next 2 years, conservative measures which would claw back money allocated to several departments. The Liberals would retain student loan debt relief. It's kind of in the weeds stuff as far as we're concerned. On the other side of the Atlantic, yes, but it's massively important. The moment to watch for is 8:30 local time tonight. That's where it will, they hope, go through the House of Representatives that you're looking at there. Then it goes over to the Senate. If it passes there, well, then the game of chicken is over. But it's been high-stakes stuff, no question about that. Some might say manufactured jeopardy in order that both sides get what they want. But it's still jeopardy.
A high-stakes game of chicken. I think that is the perfect way of summing it up. And Mark, I want to make the most of having you on the programme tonight and ask you a bit about the US election as well, if I may, because I feel like there's often an assumption that, look, it's going to be Biden versus Trump, but that's not necessarily the case, is it? The Republican race has been hotting up a bit recently.
Yeah, the elections isn't until November next year, but as always, the election season here gets underway very, very early. The Democratic Party candidate is Joe Biden. That much is clear. He's the incumbent president. He said he's going to run again. No one will really stand in his way. But on the other side, on the right, yes, Donald Trump is the presumptive candidate based on the polls. He is way ahead of all the others. He's announced he's going to run. But behind him is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, doing pretty well. A man who does not one bit see eye to eye with Donald Trump anymore. They are very much at loggerheads. They're throwing insults at each other. Donald Trump has been calling him Ron DeSanctimonious for quite some time. Ron DeSantis has more recently been upping his punches towards Donald Trump as well. So those are the two candidates which I guess the headlines are focusing on. And they are angry candidates. They thrive on division. They thrive on presenting the country as falling apart and that they are the only people who can bring it back together in a very conservative way. Behind them, though, Sophie, I think there are some really interesting people that, yes, only have a crumb of support at the moment, but we're a long way from the election. Things could change. The two that I think are worth watching, just because their persona is different from those main two, are Tim Scott and Asa Hutchinson. Tim Scott is a senator from South Carolina. He is the only black Republican in the Senate. He is very conservative. His views on abortion, his views on guns are as you would expect them to be. But his style is so different. He is not all about anger and division. He is not an angry candidate in the way that Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis are presenting themselves. Asa Hutchinson is a former governor of Arkansas, also a man with just a crumb of support at the moment, but a man who hopes to do a lot better. Again, the persona of his is one of inclusiveness, trying from his very conservative point of view to bring the country together in a way that many would argue Trump and DeSantis are not. Now, the problem that these two men have got with their inclusive vibe is that many of the people on the right of politics are angry as Trump and DeSantis are. They are angry because they feel they have been neglected. They are angry because they feel that their conservative values are being eroded. And so that anger, perhaps, is what's actually going to drive the politician, drive people to vote, rather than the inclusive, more wholesome candidacies of Hutchinson and Scott.
It's really interesting. I mean, you were mentioning there about Donald Trump as well, saying that he's the candidate to beat if you look at the polling. And there's a story that's come out today, isn't there, saying that he's been captured on tape talking about a classified document that he kept after leaving the White House. That's CNN reporting, apparently an audio recording, I think, of a 2021 meeting in which Trump acknowledges he held onto a classified Pentagon document. Is this the kind of thing that could impact Donald Trump, or is it, again, is he a bit of a Teflon candidate? You know, is this water off a duck's back?
Well, he has a base of support, which from our journeys around the country is holding. There's no question about that. But his base has a ceiling, and the continued sort of issues that he has got, legal issues that he's got, and this one is the latest, just emerging now on CNN, that remember, some classified documents were found at his Mar-a-Lago his Mar-a-Lago residence. He said that, yeah, they were there, but he declassified them because he has the right to do that. There's a question mark over whether he does have the right. But now it emerges that federal prosecutors say that they have a recording of him saying that he took a classified document back in 2021 related to a potential attack on Iran. The inference there that he knew it was classified, and yet he took it anyway. This is one of so many issues that is causing Trump trouble. And I think there will be a proportion of voters who are fed up with the chaos that surrounds Donald Trump, and they'll look for something different. The question is, will they look for DeSantis, who is seen as Trump without the chaos, same policies, same Trumpian vibe, but without the chaos? Or will they look for someone perhaps a little bit more inclusive? At the moment, the polls suggest it would be Trump or DeSantis.
It's going to be a fascinating race, it really is. Mark, thank you very much. Mark Stone there with the latest from Washington. You're watching The Take. We are live in Westminster for you. Up next, we're going to be hearing from Labour and also taking a closer look at just how much the two party leaders, the major party leaders, are viewed across the country. Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Well, time now to get the view from Labour. A little earlier, I spoke to the party's shadow employment minister, Justin Madders. So Boris Johnson has said that he has handed over his unredacted WhatsApps to the Cabinet Office. Should they now release them to the COVID-19 inquiry?
Yes, they should. And I think it's probably important to say that Boris Johnson's handed them in late already. I don't know what the problem was, but it's a bit of a mess when you have the government instigating an inquiry. In fact, it was Boris Johnson who set this up, presumably on the basis that they would cooperate with it. And then we've had all this argument about what should and shouldn't be disclosed. And I think it's really important that they get full disclosure, because it's important for public confidence that the inquiry is seen to be robust, that the families of loved ones have all their questions answered. And importantly as well, we learn lessons about what's gone wrong. And the only way that can happen for sure is if all the information is handed over to the judge leading the inquiry, and then she can make the decisions about what is relevant and what isn't.
I guess just to put the counter-argument, we've seen how easy it is for WhatsApps to end up in the public domain with the Matt Hancock WhatsApps. And I'm sure everyone enjoyed seeing, Michael Gove and Matt Hancock sending love heart emojis to each other. But is it really relevant and in the public interest? Is it fair enough that people should expect a degree of privacy?
Well, I think it's important that these messages are disclosed because it's very clear from the exchanges, in fact, between Matt Hancock and Michael Gove, that policy was being made in that way. Indeed, they made a joke about meetings being a therapeutic environment where people could express their concerns before you and I decide the policy. That was what Michael Gove said to Matt Hancock. So it's clear, actually, that these messaging apps are being used to formulate government policy, which is why it's so important that the inquiry gets to see them all.
OK. I just want to talk about your brief for a minute, because you're the Shadow Minister for Employment Rights. And I was thinking before the interview, it strikes me that we're going through a bit of a watershed moment when it comes to what behaviour is and isn't acceptable in the workplace. We've obviously seen it with the CBI, Tesco, Philip Schofield and ITV. I don't know if you think that there is something happening, a bit of a watershed.
Well, I think it's important that anyone whose behaviour is unacceptable in the workplace is challenged, and actually people are confident enough to actually challenge that behaviour. Now, clearly, some of these issues have been going on for many years and haven't been capable of being challenged, but it's important that once someone steps forward and makes those kind of complaints, that they're taken seriously, that steps taken to actually address them, and organisations are seen to have a good look at themselves as well to see whether they've actually handled things properly in the past.
And not to talk about anything specific, because I know that people query some allegations and feel that they've been wrongfully treated in individual cases. But do you think that it's a good thing that culture does seem to be shifting more widely?
Absolutely, and obviously we know in Parliament there's been plenty of allegations about inappropriate conduct, bullying and harassment, and we absolutely need to make sure that everyone feels comfortable and treated with respect and dignity when they go into work, and anything we can do to help that has got to be welcomed.
And there's just one other story I'd like to ask you about. Labour has taken £1.4 million in donations from the founder of Just Stop Oil. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, I think it's probably another way of putting it is that we've taken donations from Dale Vince, who is the owner of Ecotricity, which is a multi-million-pound company. You could talk about it in that sense. You could also talk about it in the sense that the Conservatives have taken donations off individuals who have funded organisations that deny climate change. We're not responsible for what an individual chooses to support in other areas, but what we're very clear is that the tactics of Just Stop Oil are not acceptable.
At the same time, though, we will talk to the Conservatives about these allegations as well and about donations that they get. But I guess, £1.4 million, what do you think they're hoping for in relation to that donation? People don't normally give £1.4 million out of the goodness of their hearts.
Well, I think if you talk to Dale Vince about what he's seen from the Labour Party, particularly in recent years, it's a real commitment to tackling climate change. You will know about our green investment plan to really green the economy, and that's something that we feel very passionately about. He's obviously wanting us to carry on with that and get a chance to deliver that in government. It's certainly not a case that he who pays the piper calls the tune.
What's your view more widely on Just Stop Oil? Do you think it's one of those cases where the ends justifies the means?
Well, look, I think the fact that a lot of the discussion about Just Stop Oil ends up being about the tactics that they use and the disruption that they cause. And obviously when people are stopped from getting to work or ambulances are unable to go and treat patients or get to hospital, it becomes a completely different debate. And I think, I would ask them to reflect really on whether the disruption they're causing is actually doing their cause more harm than good.
OK, thank you very much indeed for being on the programme. Always good to talk, thank you. Well, we've heard from the government and Labour. Time now to sort of zoom out and look at some of the wider issues in politics, because There have been arguments for years about whether the UK political system is getting more presidential, with a focus on the leader rather than the party. So what about the two main party leaders now? Just how much of an asset are they with crucial parts of the electorate ahead of the general election next year? Well, presumably next year. We're joined now by Tryl, who is the UK Director of More in Common, former government SPAD as well, who has some quite interesting polling on that, haven't you? So what's the main takeaway then?
Well, what we wanted to look at was how much of an asset was each of the leaders to their respective political parties. There's been the suggestion that although the Conservatives are in the polling doldrums, that actually Rishi Sunak's personal appeal might be enough to pull them over the line. And what came back was really interesting. So, first of all, voters agreed that Rishi Sunak was an asset to the party. They definitely thought, actually, he was better than the Conservative brand. But the interesting thing was when we asked the same question about Keir Starmer, voters were almost as likely to say that Keir Starmer was an asset to his party too. In fact, actually, what we tend to find in our focus groups is people tend to think the same things about both leaders, actually. They think they're both kind of competent, they're both kind of good at the job, but they worry that both of them are perhaps a little bit posh and out of touch with their lives.
I've got to ask the question. We're looking at some of that polling. You can see the overall very similar between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. But the popularity of the parties must come into this as well, right? So, you know, you might say, oh, I quite like Pep Guardiola, but if you really hate Man City, you're still going to want them to lose, right?
Absolutely that. You know, what is driving politics at the moment is perceptions of the two parties, and voters haven't suddenly given the Tories a free pass. You know, they remember what happened with Boris, what happened with the mini-budget, and that's driving the opinion polls at the moment. But I guess the Tories had this hope that perhaps if Sunak was far more popular than Keir Starmer, it might be enough to carry them over the line when people really focus on who do we want as Prime Minister. What that polling shows, certainly at the top level, there really isn't that much difference between the two of them.
That's really interesting. You've also broken it down into kind of key voter groups. I just want to have a quick look at some of this. I think we can show one on the screen now. So this is loyal nationalists, effectively people in... Oh, sorry. Nationals, I should get that one right, effectively red wall voters. What's this showing?
Yeah, so this is the group of voters who swung behind Boris Johnson and delivered victory in the red wall. You know, they're traditionally Labour voters, but switched to the Conservatives after Brexit. And the really interesting thing here is that this group of voters, when you ask them if Rishi Sunak's an asset to the Conservatives, they say no, narrowly, but they say no. But when you ask them about Keir Starmer and whether he's an asset to the Labour Party, they say the opposite. So it's interesting. Amongst that group who will determine those red wall seats, actually more of them think Keir Starmer's an asset to Labour than think Rishi Sunak's an asset to the Conservatives.
And if they do define the election, as many argue they did last time...
If they define the election... And again,
bad news for...
This resonates with what we hear in our focus groups, that Rishi Sunak, they really just wonder, does he really care about things like levelling up? A lot of the stories, you know, things about the swimming pool, the shoes, actually cut through with that group. And it's hard for him to be able to present that he really cares and understands their lives.
So that's a red wall. And we've been hearing more and more about the blue wall, right? So the kind of traditional Conservative seats that are now swinging away from them, sometimes the Lib Dems as well. This is what your polling showed when it comes to who you're describing, established Liberals, blue wall. There's quite a difference there between the two men, though.
Absolutely, and this is what's so fascinating. So this is your group. You might think of them as being like Cameronite Tories in the blue walls, more traditional Tory seats in the southeast. And if you ask them about the two leaders, they agree that both leaders are an asset to their party. But Rishi Sunak, they think it by a really, it's actually quite a stonking margin. And what we've seen with that group of voters who didn't particularly like Boris, they actually tended to vote Remain, they don't really like the culture wars, they really like Rishi Sunak, and he started to win them back in large numbers. And I think that might be the Conservatives' hope with this presidential campaign. It might not be enough to save the party and win the election. It doesn't look like it'll be enough to help in places like the Red Wall, but enough of those more traditional Conservative voters might stick with them to stop it being a 1997-style rout.
It's interesting listening to you, though, because you're talking about those voters and you're saying they voted Remain, they don't like the culture wars. And I'm looking at the programme of government at the minute. There's a lot about stopping the votes. There's a lot about making Brexit work and not going back on Brexit. why are they not trying to appeal to these blue wall voters? That they're focusing on the red wall voters who, if what you're saying is right, they might have already gone.
Well, this is one of the most fascinating paradoxes, that the group of voters who most like Rishi Sunak, if you actually look at his ideological profile, some people have suggested he's the most socially conservative Prime Minister we've had, at least since the 90s. It doesn't align with them at all. And we think there's a danger that by pursuing this kind of more culture warry, socially conservative strategy, that he doesn't win back those red wall voters who are particularly concerned about the cost of living and the NHS, but also these blue wall voters think, oh, God, he's not quite what we thought. Actually, he's more right-wing than Boris on stuff, and he loses them as well. So there's a real danger that the Conservatives find themselves falling between two stools if they're not careful.
What's your prediction then? There's lots of chat about whether or not Labour's on course to win a majority, if they are more likely to be heading into coalition territory, if there is a landing zone for the Conservatives. Where are you at?
Well, look, I mean, what I always go back to is, this time 3 years ago, the Conservatives were on 55% in the polls. They're now at about sort of 28%. So this is a very volatile electorate. But I think the thing which does it for me is we asked people we polled recently to describe what they thought of Britain. It was for the New Britain project. And the top word that came up was broken. And until that changes, it's really hard to see a path to a Conservative victory. At the moment, if there were an election tomorrow, I'd be predicting quite a comfortable Labour majority. But there's a year to go. We've seen lots change already. More could still change.
It's really interesting. Thanks very much for coming on and talking us through some of your research. Thank you. You're watching The Take. We're live in Westminster. We've had a busy show already, but up next, possibly, as we were saying, a year to go until the general election, we're going to be looking at some electoral cycles from years gone by to see how things compare now. Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You are watching The Take. Now, a general election is not that far away. The smart money reckons spring or probably autumn of next year. And it's pretty clear that the political fight between the major parties is already hotting up. Now, Labour's well ahead in the polls, expected to be the largest party, but number 10 hopes it steady the Conservative ship and can pull things around. So, about a year out from an election, how do things compare to previous electoral cycles? There is no one better to ask than our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who joins us again now. John, what was the first election that you covered?
1983 as a political journalist, yes.
There you go. So John's seen it all, right? John knows...
Margaret Thatcher won a majority of 144 in that.
There you go. I'm really interested to know your take on where the next election fits. What's it going to be similar to?
You talk to MPs, the big debate at the moment is, with this big Labour opinion poll lead, is it going to be like 1997, when Labour won a massive majority, or is it going to be like 1992, when Labour thought they were going to win? And, of course, John Major pipped them on April the 9th, an anniversary of the day he met Norma Major at a Tory event. He won by with a majority of 21. This is Tony Blair in 1997. Remember that morning festival hall? A new dawn has broken, has it not? I'm not sure if that photo is at the festival hall or in Downing Street. I think that's the festival hall with all those flags.
Wonderful photo.
I was actually in Downing Street that Friday morning when he walked up Downing Street with Cherie. And I was quite... They put on a good show, the Labour Party, in those days.
So the hope, I guess, for Labour is it's going to be like 97. They need a swing like 97 to get there, right?
The arithmetic's different, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, what happened between 92 and 97, I mentioned that Major had a majority of 21. Throughout that Parliament, the Conservatives lost by-election after by-election after by-election, and some of their Tories MPs defected as well. So when we got to 97, there was no... the Tories had no majority. This time... Tories they started with an 80-seat majority. They've got a mountain to climb, as Keir Starmer keeps acknowledging. Good news for them. Scotland's looking better for them. There's a poll recently suggested they could pick up another 23 seats in Scotland. No wonder Keir Starmer's on the shuttle to Glasgow or Edinburgh every 5 minutes, because that's a key battleground. Now, this is a poll. This shows 1992. I know you like a graph, Sophie.
I do like a graph.
Yeah,
you pulled out a really interesting one as well.
Now, look at this. Let me, if I can go over here. Look at that massive gap there. That's when Labour had a 20-plus point gap around about the time when Margaret Thatcher was very, very unpopular. And, of course, they dumped her in November 1990. But look what happened after that under John Major. And the key bit is this bit here. I was political editor of the Daily Express during the Major years. And look at those polls. And look at the very, very last bit. The Tories up, Labour down, after months and months of Labour leads. We in the Daily Express, we had the last opinion poll on the Wednesday morning, and they were virtually neck and neck. And, of course, Mr Major won with a majority of 21. What went wrong for Labour? Some people blame a shadow budget by the late John Smith. Then there was that dreadful Kinnock rally, triumphalism. We're all right. He said it 3 times. I won't do it 3 times. People blame Kinnock for it. And, of course, John Smith died in 94. Tony Blair became leader and the Labour recovery really took off. People say what would have happened if John Smith had not died. I think Labour would have won in 97, but not with the landslide that Tony Blair got.
Fascinating. And I guess the takeaway is you never know what's happening with politics, and that is really what the big lesson has been for us over the last year.
Margaret Thatcher always said in politics the unexpected always happens.
There you go. And as this there from John Craig, great to have you on the show. I know that John's got to get out of here to get to your live in the 10 o'clock news. That is it for The Take. We actually won't be back next Wednesday, but our Sunday programme is back as usual at 8:30 this Sunday. Next up, it is Sky News at 10. Thanks very much for watching. Another busy week in politics, even though it's recess. That political news never stops.